my gosh, I need to do something different with my life. I need to try to help refugees in some way. I was starting a philosophy PhD, and I was like, what can I do as a philosopher that could be remotely helpful? It turns out that actually philosophers have a lot to say about refugee law. So, the main questions, of course, as philosophers, we're going to ask who, what, why. Who ought to count as a refugee? So, one question that people often have, should we expand the concept, the category of refugee to include more people, to include more of that category of displaced folks that aren't currently included? Another big question, what do we owe to refugees? So what do states owe to refugees? What do we as the public owe to them? And then why? Why do we have refugee law? Why was, what's the normative grounds for this institution of refugeehood? Why morally ought we have this institution? Why should states be party to the Refugee Convention? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that last question because this is what my current research is on. So I'm writing about the moral grounds for refugeehood. Why do we have this? It's one of the most powerful human rights laws out there. It's actually a law that has not just saved millions of people, but it's allowed them to do it by this self-actuating mechanism where people vote with their feet and take themselves out of danger. I think that every state has an obligation to be party to the Refugee Convention. Why? Why do they have this obligation? So there are three major views. The first view is the humanitarian view of the Refugee Convention. The second is the political view. And the third is the legitimacy repair view. These are three separate views. I'm going to talk about each of them briefly. So this is the most obvious view. This is the place everyone starts. Well, duh, refugeehood saves people. Having the Refugee Convention saves lives. So the first moral reason people give is like states ought to recognize refugees because states are obligated to save the lives of anyone who's fleeing danger. Well, the interesting thing is people have actually had a lot of trouble explaining why states specifically are obligated to resettle refugees. So these are some of the famous objections. First, people sometimes say, well, states don't have moral duties to protect people who are on their territory or already members in some way. So when it comes to asylum seekers, most people are like, yeah, states have to protect them, they're on their territory. When it comes to refugees, states will say, I don't really have any obligations to those folks. They're not a resident and they're not a member. The second kind of objection that's often made to this view is that sometimes people just say, like, this is too overwhelming. There are so many people who are in danger. There's so many people who are in danger of dying of poverty. There's so many people who are in danger out there. Why should we focus specifically on refugees who have fled? Couldn't states sort of discharge their duties to the poor and to the needy and the vulnerable by giving charity or aid? So that's the humanitarian view. These are some reasons why people often think that the humanitarian view can't possibly be the whole story. They say, like, it's not enough just to save lives. You have to explain why states are obligated to save lives in this particular way. So in response to that problem, some philosophers, Matthew Price, Matthew Lister, Max Cherim, a bunch of men named Matthew, a bunch of philosophers came up with this view called, this is the political view of refugeehood. So in this view, the idea is that the reason that states are obligated to make sure that people receive asylum or refugee status is because we have a state system where to be protected you need to be a member of a state. Your protection comes to you from a state government. You have to be a member at least in one place. If you don't have that protection, you are going to be in terrible danger. So the idea is, like, when you get asylum, you're receiving surrogate membership. It's not just an offer of protection. You're actually getting, like, a new pathway to citizenship. It's important that anyone who's not currently protected by a state receive this kind of surrogate membership in order for our sort of nation-state system to continue to function. So the view then is that states are obligated to offer asylum or resettlement to refugees because refugees are people who lack membership to begin with. I think I might have said that in a way that was a little bit confusing, so let me take one more pass on this. The idea is like, we've got a system of global governance where you've got to be a member somewhere. You've got to be a Mexican citizen, or you've got to be an American citizen, or you've got to be a Chilean citizen. If you're not a citizen somewhere, you aren't protected by anyone. The state is the source of your protection. If you are not protected, you are in a lot of trouble. And so, on this view, in order for us to have a sort of just and legitimate global order, we need to make sure that everybody has protection and membership in at least one place. And so the point of the refugee system is making sure that the people who are going to fall through the cracks get that membership in at least one place. We're scooping them up, we're giving them new membership. That's the view. Also, if I'm a little confusing or if I'm going too fast, just raise your hand and ask me to repeat, please. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the political view is that it states that the point of asylum is not to save people, but actually to express condemnation of the countries these people are fleeing. So, on this view, grants of asylum are essentially a kind of foreign policy, and it's on a continuum with verbal expressions of condemnation of foreign states, sanctions, and military interventions. Why is that important? Why is that interesting? This view was particularly influential in the US in the 1980s. This was a period when there was a lot of bias in asylum determinations. So there was actually an inverse relationship between the level of human rights abuses in the places where people were fleeing and the likelihood that they would get asylum. So a study found that if you were fleeing from Russia, for example, you were much more likely to get asylum than if you were fleeing from Nicaragua, and that couldn't be entirely explained by the human rights abuses happening in those places. It was better explained by the fact that the US had a foreign policy mandate to take in more people who were fleeing Russia as a kind of condemnation of communism, as opposed to taking in people who were fleeing places like Nicaragua, El Salvador is what I was thinking of. But the interesting thing about this is pretty soon we have asylum functioning not so much as a humanitarian institution, but as an institution that's aimed to sort of make chess moves on our foreign policy board. We're trying to use asylum to say the places that these people are fleeing are really bad places. We're going to take people from Cuba, we're going to take people from Russia because we want to make those places look bad. If the people are fleeing a country that is one of our allies, we're much less likely to actually give them asylum, because the point of asylum is to make these places look bad. That is what the people who argued for the political view, this was their conception of how asylum should work. Okay. Happy to take questions about this in a moment. So, there are, again, some famous objections to this view. The first one is that the political view can't possibly explain why we should give asylum to refugees who are still members of the place they've fled. The second big problem is that it prioritizes condemning other countries over saving lives. So, this philosophical view has been tremendously influential, but it's also helps to explain why we saw so much bias in those asylum rulings from the 80s. There was, like I said, truly like an inverse relationship between the seriousness of human rights abuses in the places people were fleeing and the likelihood those people would actually get asylum. Last, I want to talk about the legitimacy repair view. And this is the view that I've been working on and developing alongside some other philosophers. So the legitimacy repair view of of asylum is the view that the role of asylum, the reason that we have it, is to function as a reparative mechanism for international nation-state legitimacy. Let me explain what that means. What does legitimacy mean? There are two ways to talk about legitimacy. The first of them is descriptive. So we say an authority is regarded as legitimate if those governed believe that they ought to obey the authority. then we can talk about normative legitimacy. So an authority is normatively legitimate if the governed ought to obey the authority. And philosophers tend to think that a state is going to be normatively legitimate if it's met these two kinds of conditions. If the government is elected by a procedurally fair process, and if its policies are minimally just. So why am I talking about legitimacy? The legitimacy repair view of asylum is the view that the international state system itself cannot be legitimate unless we have an institution like asylum or refugeehood that is helping to ameliorate some of the major injustices that are predictably generated by this system. So this is the way that Gillian Brock sets up the view. She says, first of all, to exercise power legitimately, states have to respect their own citizens' human rights. If you don't respect your own citizens' human rights, you're not a legitimate government. She says, though, we have to remember that we can talk not just about the legitimacy of individual state governments, like the legitimacy of the American government, we can talk about the legitimacy of the whole system, of the entire nation-state system that we have. This entire global order, we can say, is that system that we have legitimate. She says that exercising power legitimately is also conditional on being part of a legitimate state system. And the legitimacy of that system as a whole requires states to participate in the cooperative project needed to sustain a justified state system. Individual states have some positive obligations that are generated in virtue of the legitimacy conditions on the state system. I know that that sounded just like jargon, so I'm going to explain that in more natural language. So what Brock is saying here is, like, we need to think about the political system that we live under. We live under a system of states. It wasn't always this way. Before states, there were, we can talk about kings and queens, we can talk about a feudal system, we can talk about Native American tribes. There were other ways of organizing ourselves politically. Having state governments, having the whole world covered in states, that's actually a kind of recent historical development. It wasn't always like this. We didn't always have this kind of political organization. And because it's just one way that we could possibly organize ourselves, we have to be able to see that it's not something that we were fated to have. It's not something that is necessarily natural. I think sometimes we can't imagine any other kind of political organization, but it's not like we were born with states in the way that we're born with our fingers and toes. This is a system that's just one way of organizing territory and political membership. And this is a system that Brock and other philosophers have pointed out actually tends to produce injustice in very predictable ways. And her view is that in order to counter those predictable injustices, we need corrective mechanisms. We need mechanisms like the asylum system that can correct some of the problems of our global political system. So let me say more about what exactly is asylum fixing. So this is what my research is on right now, is I'm thinking about what exactly are these predictable injustices that these philosophers are talking about when they say that there are downsides to having a state system. What do they mean? What are those downsides? Well, I think that there are at least three that we can talk about. I mean, if we know what injustices are targeted, we can think about what sort of the function of asylum actually is. So, like I said, I think there are three. So the first is that this is a system where states have near total power over their citizens. So think about that story I told you at the beginning about my aunt living in Venezuela. There's nobody with any oversight, or really any real oversight, over the Venezuelan government. This is true of pretty much any state. The UN is a very weak political institution. States do not have a lot of, there's very little oversight over what states do to their people. It's largely up to them whether they fulfill the human rights of their own people or not. And so that's the first problem with organizing ourselves politically this way, is that we've concentrated great amounts of power in these state governments, and there's very little accountability for how they use that power. And so that's the first feature that's predictably leads to problems, and we see everywhere that states often abuse their people. Here's the second problem. So Anna Stills, she's a very famous philosopher at Princeton, she writes about this as well. She says, we need to stop thinking just about politics in terms of like peoples or populations that are assigned to governments as if people just float in space. Because politics is territorial. We're all located in territorial space. We are in countries, and those countries have borders. And so she says the second problem that we see with this sort of like global political order is that we've not just assigned peoples to governments, we've also assigned them to territories. And you are confined to the territory that you're in. That's going to determine your life in many ways. And we often find that these territories, they've developed out of historical processes, but it's somewhat arbitrary that I happened to be born, I was actually born in the United States. I could have been born in Haiti, which is a small island. I could have been born in Siberia, in Russia. Where I'm born, the territory that I'm in, determines what resources I have access to. It determines a lot of my future life prospects, and it does so in a very arbitrary way. We can go even further by talking about the differences in the natural resources that different countries have access to. We can say that there's a big reason for the inequality that we see can be explained by things like some countries being located over large amounts of oil and some countries are not. The point that Anna Stills is trying to make in talking about territorial assignments is that a great amount of the inequality of the world just comes down to what place did you end up in, how rich is the territory there, what are the resources that are available to you there, is there fresh water, what actually is there for you. The last thing that I want to point to that I think has been really overlooked as sort of a problem with how we're organizing ourselves politically, like internationally and politically, is that we have not just given states incredible power over their own citizens, they also have near total control over territorial borders. So in international law, it's considered a sovereign right of the state that they can control and regulate the movement of people and goods over their borders. That's supposed to be really an unalienable and unabridgeable right of the state. I think that in a perfect world, where states never abused their people, and where all of the resources were divided up fairly, that might be fine for states to have total control over their borders. But because we don't live in that kind of a perfect world, we live in a world where actually you may end up in a situation where you are abused by your government, or where you do not have access to the resources that you need to live. This fact that states can close their borders off to you compounds the human rights issues that are the result of the first two issues. So the research that I'm doing here is thinking about not just what it means to live in a single state, but what it means to live in a world that's governed by a state system, where you cannot go anywhere but Antarctica to escape this particular system, and the sorts of life opportunities that you have is determined by the system as a whole. So I pointed to all of these injustices as a way of developing this idea of the legitimacy repair view of asylum. If we think that there are major issues with the system as a whole, what we need is international law, what we need is international institutions that help to address those particular endemic features of the system itself. So I think that, as you can tell from the last slide, I actually think that there's a lot that might need repairing, that maybe we have a long way to go in developing a global political system in which people are not sort of routinely subjected to human rights abuses. But I think that asylum is well justified as one particular step on that path. That asylum is an institution that relocates people who have suffered from abuse by their states, who have been trapped, who have not been able to cross borders, and as such it's helping to mitigate the sorts of predictable injustices that I was just talking about. And it's on that basis that asylum is morally justified. So this is the argument that I'm developing in my dissertation. All right, so I know that this might have been a more difficult presentation than maybe some folks signed up for, but if you guys have questions, I would really love to hear them. This is research that I'm developing now for my dissertation. Questions, thoughts, even, I was confused about this. Can you repeat this for me? I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking. Also, if folks still have questions about the first part, I'm happy to answer those as well. Thanks. Thank you so much also for all of you for coming and listening.
Oh, yeah.